The tropical sun burned through the cockpit canopy at 18,000 feet above the Solomon Islands, August 1943, and the air inside the P-38 Lightning felt like breathing from an oven, despite the altitude. Lieutenant Richard Bong scanned the sky with practiced movements, eyes constantly shifting between instrument panel, surrounding airspace, and the formation of aircraft around him. His wingman flew 300 yards to his right, maintaining proper spacing. Below them, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly, a blue mirror reflecting clouds that looked like scattered cotton against an impossibly bright sky. The radio crackled with routine position reports. Navigation was challenging this far from base, with few landmarks beyond occasional islands and the sun's position. Bong had been flying combat missions for 4 months now, long enough to develop the instincts that separated survivors from casualties, but not so long that he'd grown complacent. Complacency killed more pilots than enemy action in some squadrons. The attack came from above and behind, exactly where Bong's peripheral vision had the largest blind spot. 3 Japanese Zero fighters had climbed above the American formation using clouds for concealment, then dove from the sun. Classic tactics. The first indication of trouble was tracers streaking past Bong's left wing, bright against the blue sky. Then his wingman's voice, tight with panic, shouting contact reports that were already obsolete by the time they finished transmitting. Bong watched his wingman's P-38 take hits along the fuselage. Smoke poured from the left engine. The aircraft rolled hard right, then entered a spiral that steepened with each rotation. No parachute appeared. The fighter simply corkscrewed downward toward the ocean 18,000 feet below, trailing black smoke that marked its descent like a funeral ribbon against the sky. 3 zeros. Bong counted them quickly, identifying their positions relative to his aircraft. 2 were pursuing the spiraling P-38, probably to confirm the kill. The third, the formation leader, judging by his position and aggressive maneuvering, had already shifted focus to Bong. The Japanese pilot was good, positioning his aircraft with practiced efficiency. He understood energy management and angle of attack. This wasn't some rookie pilot fresh from training. This was a veteran who'd been killing American pilots for months, maybe years. Bong executed the defensive maneuver exactly as taught at training bases back in California. Hard right bank, full throttle on both Allison engines, attempting to convert his straight and level flight into a climbing spiral that would force the pursuing Zero to overshoot or lose energy trying to follow. The P-38 responded well. Twin booms created some drag, but the aircraft had power and could climb quickly when needed. But the Zero turned inside him. Not just slightly inside, but dramatically inside, cutting across the circle of Bong's turn like it was drawn on rails. The Japanese pilot knew exactly what he was doing. He'd probably fought this same scenario dozens of times against American fighters trying the same textbook maneuver. He was already compensating, leading his target, sliding into a firing position that would give him a clean shot at Bong's cockpit. 4 seconds. Maybe 4 seconds before 20mm cannon fire tore through the P-38's airframe. Bong could see the Zero clearly now, close enough to distinguish individual panel lines on its fuselage, close enough to see the dark opening of cannon barrels in its wings, close enough to know with absolute certainty that continuing this climbing turn meant death. What happened next wasn't conscious decision-making. There wasn't time for rational analysis. It was pure instinct driven by desperation, the kind of split-second reaction that emerges when the brain realizes conventional options lead to certain death. Bong rolled his P-38 completely inverted, watching the horizon flip upside down, then yanked the control stick forward toward his lap. In normal flight, pulling back on the stick brought the nose up. Positive G-forces pushed the pilot down into his seat, compressed his spine, forced blood toward his feet. But inverted, everything reversed. Forward stick meant the nose pitched downward relative to the earth, but upward relative to the cockpit. The aircraft dove toward the ocean, But because Bong was hanging upside down in his straps, because the world was inverted, he was pulling away in a direction the Zero pilot never anticipated. The physiological response was immediate and violent. Blood rushed to Bong's head with tremendous force. He felt pressure building behind his eyes, a sensation like someone was inflating a balloon inside his skull. His vision didn't just narrow, it transformed. The entire visual field turned red, literally crimson, as blood vessels in his eyes, engorged with blood, forced upward by negative acceleration. For 2 critical seconds, Bong was effectively blind. He couldn't see his instrument panel clearly. The altimeter was a blur, airspeed indicator unreadable, attitude instruments meaningless. He was hanging inverted in his harness, plunging toward the Pacific at increasing speed, with no visual confirmation that he was maintaining aircraft control. His hands kept the stick forward through pure muscle memory. Training had emphasized instrument flying, trusting the gauges when visual references failed. But no training had prepared him for this, for flying blind through choice while someone tried to kill him. The temptation to ease off the stick pressure, to relieve the crushing sensation in his head, was overwhelming. But some part of his brain understood that releasing pressure meant reducing the maneuver's effectiveness, which meant the Zero might follow him through the dive. When Bong rolled level again at 12,000 feet, his vision clearing as positive G-forces returned to normal. The Zero was above him. The Japanese pilot had attempted to follow initially, pushing his aircraft into a dive to pursue. But something had prevented him from matching Bong's dive angle or speed. Maybe structural concerns about overstressing his airframe, maybe engine problems during inverted flight. Maybe simple disbelief that an American pilot would execute such a maneuver. The Zero was completely out of position, overshooting, having committed to pursuing a target that was no longer where expected. Bong had survived. More than survived. He'd reversed the tactical situation entirely. The aircraft that had been hunting him seconds ago was now vulnerable, having bled energy and altitude, trying to follow through an unconventional maneuver. Bong didn't press the advantage. He was alone, separated from his formation, with no wingman and limited ammunition. The smart move was to use his altitude separation to disengage, get back to friendly airspace, and survive to fight another day. But as he turned his P-38 toward home, Bong knew something significant had just happened. He'd stumbled onto a tactic that contradicted everything taught at flight school, something that worked precisely because it violated conventional wisdom. The flight back to base gave him time to think about what he'd done. The maneuver had been instinctive, born from desperation. But analyzing it afterward, Bong could see why it had worked. The Zero pilot had expected either a continued climbing turn, which he could counter, or perhaps a standard dive away, which he could follow. Rolling, inverted, and diving had created a vector the Japanese pilot hadn't anticipated, buying crucial seconds of separation. Back at base, Bong said nothing about the maneuver in his official debriefing. He reported engaging 3 Zeros, losing his wingman, and disengaging under pressure. The intelligence officer taking notes was more interested in confirming the Zero count and their markings than in specific tactical details. Combat reports at this stage of the war were filled with stories of Americans barely surviving encounters with Japanese fighters. Bong's experience wasn't unusual enough to warrant special attention. But that evening, talking with other pilots over warm beer in the sweltering heat of their tent camp, Bong described what he'd done in more detail. A few pilots had experienced similar situations, rolling inverted under stress and somehow surviving. They'd attributed it to luck or panic, rather than recognizing it as a potential technique. One pilot mentioned that instructors back in training had explicitly warned against inverted flight, saying it would cause engine failure or structural damage. The conversation revealed something important. The gap between peacetime training doctrine and combat reality was getting pilots killed. Everything taught at stateside bases assumed fighting opponents who followed similar rules, who engaged in predictable ways. But Japanese pilots, especially Zero pilots, had refined their tactics through years of actual combat over China. They knew every advantage their aircraft possessed and exactly how to exploit American weaknesses. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had entered combat operations over China in 1940, more than a year before America's entry into the war. By December 1941, when Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor and swept across the Pacific, their naval aviators had accumulated thousands of combat hours. They weren't learning their trade against practiced targets or in simulated combat. They were perfecting tactics against Chinese pilots flying Soviet-supplied fighters, facing real anti-aircraft fire, dealing with actual combat damage and navigation challenges. This experience created a massive skill advantage that American pilots discovered the hard way. Early engagement reports from the Philippines told grim stories. Army Air Force P-40 Warhawks encountered Zeros over Clark Field and found themselves outmatched. Marine F-4F Wildcats defending Wake Island fought desperately against Zero formations and were overwhelmed. In the Dutch East Indies, Allied pilots flying Brewster Buffaloes and Curtiss P-36 Hawks were simply slaughtered. The Zero's performance characteristics created specific tactical problems that American pilots struggled to solve. At combat speeds below 300 miles per hour, the Zero could outturn virtually any fighter in the sky. Its turning radius was astonishingly tight, roughly 400 feet less than a P-38 Lightning and nearly 500 feet less than an F-4F Wildcat. This meant that in traditional dogfighting, the kind emphasized in every American training program, the Zero pilot could simply circle inside his opponent's turn and achieve a firing solution within seconds. The mathematics were brutally simple. Two aircraft entering a turning fight at similar speeds and altitudes would circle each other, each trying to position behind the other for a gun solution. The aircraft with the tighter turning radius would gradually work its way around the circle until it reached the opponent's 6 o'clock position. In a Zero versus almost any American fighter, this process took less than 2 full turns. American pilots found themselves going from attacker to target in less than 30 seconds. Early tactical guidance told American pilots to use their aircraft's advantages. The F-4F Wildcat had superior diving speed and could absorb more battle damage than a Zero. The P-40 Warhawk performed well in vertical maneuvers and had excellent low-altitude characteristics. The P-38 Lightning brought twin engines for redundancy and heavy firepower. Each American fighter type had strengths, but none could match the Zero's agility in conventional turning combat. The standard advice was to avoid turning engagements entirely. Use boom and zoom tactics. Dive on the Zero from altitude, fire, then use the speed from your dive to climb away before the Zero could respond. In theory, this exploited American advantages in dive speed and aircraft durability while avoiding the Zero's superior turning ability. In theory, combat rarely unfolded according to plan. A pilot diving on a Zero might miss with his initial burst. Target deflection was challenging, and the Zero's small profile made it a difficult target. If the attack failed to destroy the target, the Zero pilot would simply enter a tight horizontal turn. When the American pilot tried to follow, attempting to bring his guns to bear for a second shot, he found himself on the outside of the circle, bleeding energy, becoming the target instead of the hunter. Japanese pilots developed tactics specifically designed to exploit this dynamic. One common approach involved using a Zero as bait. The aircraft would fly straight and level, appearing vulnerable, often at an altitude where American fighters patrolling above might spot it. When an American pilot committed to the attack, diving down to engage, 2 more Zeros would drop from higher altitude or slide in from the flanks. The American fighter suddenly found itself defensive, and being defensive against Zeros meant entering a turning fight, which meant the Zeros' advantages became overwhelming. The kill ratios reflected this tactical imbalance. In some sectors during early and mid-1942, Japanese pilots were achieving 3-to-1 or even 4-to-1 kill ratios against American fighters. Squadron commanders filed after-action reports that essentially admitted defeat in turning combat. We cannot win these engagements using current tactics. Our aircraft are outmatched in horizontal maneuvering. Losses are unsustainable. What made the crisis worse was the skill level of Japanese naval aviators during this period. Many had been flying combat since the late 1930s. They understood energy management at an expert level, knowing exactly how to use altitude and speed to control engagements. They were skilled at deflection shooting, able to hit targets in complex three-dimensional maneuvers. Their formation tactics were sophisticated, with wingmen providing mutual support and tactical flexibility. American pilots were dying because they were fighting according to peacetime rules against an enemy who had already discarded those rules through years of actual combat experience. The training programs back in California and Arizona were producing competent pilots who could fly their aircraft well and shoot accurately at practice targets, but they weren't preparing pilots for the specific tactical challenges of fighting Zeros. The lightweight construction that gave Zeros their superior turning performance came at a cost. Japanese designers had eliminated armor protection behind the pilot's seat and used non-self-sealing fuel tanks to save weight. These decisions made the Zero highly vulnerable to battle damage. A few hits from heavy machine guns could set a Zero ablaze or kill the pilot. American fighters, by contrast, carried armor plate behind the seat, self-sealing fuel tanks that could take multiple hits without catching fire, and generally more robust construction. This created a cruel paradox. American fighters were built to help pilots survive being hit, which added weight that made them slower and less maneuverable, which made them more likely to get hit in the first place. Zeros were built for maximum performance, which made them deadly in combat, but one good burst of fire could destroy them completely. The maneuver that would eventually resolve this tactical crisis, that would give American pilots a reliable defensive option against Zero attacks, emerged from desperation rather than planning. The Split S, as it would eventually be called, involved rolling the aircraft inverted and pulling through into a diving turn. It wasn't a new maneuver in absolute terms. Aerobatic pilots had been performing Split S maneuvers for years. But using it defensively in combat, deliberately accepting negative G-forces and temporary blindness to escape an enemy in a superior firing position, that was something different. In normal flight, pilots experienced positive G-forces during maneuvers. Blood was pushed toward their feet. At around 5 or 6 Gs, many pilots experienced grey-out or blackout as blood drained from their brain. Training emphasized avoiding excessive G-forces during extended maneuvers because unconscious pilots couldn't control their aircraft. But when a pilot rolled inverted and pulled the stick forward, he experienced negative G-forces. The effect was dramatically different and far more disturbing. Instead of blood draining from the head, it rushed upward with tremendous pressure. The visual effect was called red out, because the pilot's entire field of vision literally turned red as blood vessels in the eyes engorged. Aviation medicine in 1942 suggested that humans could barely tolerate negative G-forces. The limited studies available indicated that even -2 Gs caused severe discomfort, disorientation, and potential retinal damage. Official guidance from flight surgeons recommended avoiding negative G-flight entirely. The medical literature suggested that sustained negative G-forces could cause permanent eye damage, brain hemorrhaging, and other serious injuries. These studies, however, were conducted in controlled environments with test pilots who weren't being shot at. The methodology involved gradually increasing negative G-forces while monitoring the subject's vital signs and responses. At the first sign of severe discomfort, the test would stop. The conclusion was that negative G-forces were dangerous and should be avoided. Combat created different mathematics. A pilot experiencing 2 seconds of red-out vision but escaping a Zero's gun solution survived to fly another day. A pilot who maintained perfect positive G-flight discipline but stayed in the Zero's crosshairs died. The choice wasn't comfortable versus uncomfortable, it was temporary blindness and a splitting headache versus permanent death. The physics behind why the inverted dive worked involved energy management and opponent prediction. When a Zero pilot achieved a firing position on an American aircraft's tail, he anticipated certain responses. The target would either try to outturn him, which was impossible in a horizontal turn, or attempt to climb away, which bled the American aircraft's energy and made it an easier target. Both responses played to the Zero's advantages. The inverted dive did neither. It converted altitude into speed in a vector the Zero pilot didn't expect, heading down instead of up or around. More importantly, if the Japanese pilot attempted to follow through the maneuver, his aircraft faced significant limitations. The Zero was stressed for positive G loads up to approximately 7 Gs under ideal conditions, but its lightweight construction made negative G flight particularly dangerous. Pulling negative Gs in a Zero risked structural failure. The airframe wasn't designed to handle those loads. Wing spars might crack, control surfaces could flutter or fail. Even if the structure held, the engine presented problems. The Nakajima-Sakai radial engine used in most Zeros had a carburetor-based fuel system that could experience fuel starvation during sustained inverted flight. The engine might cough, lose power, or quit entirely. The P-38 Lightning had advantages in this scenario that weren't immediately obvious. Twin Allison engines meant redundancy. If one engine experienced problems during inverted flight, the other might continue running. More importantly, the fuel systems on the Allison engines functioned more reliably under negative G loads than the carbureted engines in most single-engine fighters. This wasn't a deliberate design feature. Lockheed engineers weren't planning for inverted combat tactics when they designed the P-38, but it became operationally significant. A P-38 pilot could maintain power through an inverted dive with reasonable confidence. A pursuing Zero might experience momentary power loss at exactly the wrong moment, widening the separation between aircraft. The human body's tolerance for negative G-forces turned out to be substantially higher than medical literature suggested, provided the exposure was brief. Pilots who executed split-S maneuvers under combat stress reported that the red-out effect typically lasted only 2 to 3 seconds during a properly executed maneuver. Vision returned as the aircraft transitioned back to positive G flight during the pullout from the dive. The discomfort was intense and undeniable. Pilots reported severe headaches that could last for hours after landing. Facial petechiae, small broken blood vessels under the skin, appeared frequently. Bloodshot eyes were nearly universal after negative G maneuvers. Some pilots experienced nosebleeds, but all of these effects were temporary and non-lethal. Several pilots noted in informal debriefings that they'd rather endure a splitting headache back at base than receive a proper burial at sea. The informal risk assessment was straightforward. Negative G maneuvers hurt. Japanese cannons hurt worse and permanently. Given those options, the choice was obvious. Major Thomas Lynch of the 39th Fighter Squadron became the first pilot documented to have used the inverted dive tactic deliberately and intentionally, rather than instinctively during a panic response. Lynch was flying P-38 Lightnings out of Port Moresby, New Guinea, in April 1943. The base was crude, carved out of jungle with minimal facilities. Pilots lived in tents, dealt with tropical diseases, and flew combat missions over some of the most hostile territory in the Pacific. On April 11, 1943, Lynch led a four-plane patrol over the Huon Gulf. The mission was routine fighter sweep, looking for Japanese air activity and protecting Allied shipping. Weather was clear, visibility excellent. At 20,000 feet, the air was cool enough to be comfortable despite the tropical sun beating through the cockpit canopy. The encounter with 8 Zeros occurred without warning. Japanese fighters appeared from a cloud bank, well-positioned and aggressive. This wasn't a chance meeting. The Zero pilots had likely been directed to this location by ground controllers or had spotted Lynch's formation and maneuvered for advantage. Instead of engaging in traditional horizontal combat, Lynch immediately rolled inverted when the lead Zero closed on him. He pulled through into a steep dive, feeling the crushing pressure in his head as negative Gs took effect. His vision went red. For those critical 2 seconds, he was flying blind, trusting his initial dive angle and aircraft trim. When his vision cleared, Lynch was accelerating through 400 miles per hour at 8,000 feet. The Zero pilot who'd been pursuing him had pulled out at 12,000 feet, either unwilling or unable to match Lynch's dive angle and speed. The Japanese pilot had faced a choice: follow the P-38 through an extreme maneuver that risked structural failure, or break off and preserve his aircraft. He chose preservation. Lynch didn't just survive the encounter, he reversed the entire tactical situation. After leveling out, he had both altitude separation and superior speed. Those advantages could be converted into a position of power. Lynch used his energy advantage to climb back up toward the now disorganized Japanese formation. The Zeros had lost their cohesion, chasing after what they thought were fleeing American fighters. Lynch shot down 2 Zeros in the engagement that followed. His wingman, following his example through the inverted dive, survived without losses. The after-action report noted the tactic, but didn't emphasize it particularly. Official doctrine still discouraged negative G maneuvers based on medical guidance and peacetime safety considerations. What made Lynch's action historically significant wasn't survival through desperate improvisation. It was intentionality and repetition. Other pilots had rolled inverted under stress, survived, and attributed their survival to luck or instinct. Lynch recognized it as a repeatable, teachable technique. Within a week, he was demonstrating the maneuver to other pilots in his squadron during informal briefings that happened in the evenings after official duties ended. The instruction was direct and practical. If a Zero gets on your tail in a position where conventional maneuvers won't shake him, roll inverted, pull through, and dive hard. Use the speed gained in the dive to create separation. Don't try to outturn the Zero horizontally. That's suicide. The Zero owns the horizontal circle, but American fighters own the vertical dive. Use the dimension where you have advantage. The altitude threshold was critical. Never initiate the maneuver below 8,000 feet unless death was otherwise certain. The math was simple. At 8,000 feet, a pilot had enough altitude to complete the dive, experience the red-out phase, recover vision, assess his situation, and pull out safely. Below 8,000 feet, the margins became dangerous. Below 5,000 feet, the maneuver was suicidal unless the alternative was certain death anyway. By June 1943, the tactic had spread to other P-38 units operating throughout the Southwest Pacific Theater. Pilots shared the technique during ready room discussions and inter-squadron debriefings. It remained largely unofficial, not prohibited, but not endorsed in formal tactical directives either. Squadron leaders recognized its effectiveness but hesitated to put it in writing. The concern was partly institutional liability. If a pilot was killed attempting the maneuver, questions would arise about who authorized teaching a tactic that contradicted established training and medical guidance. There might be investigations, blame would need to be assigned. Career-ending decisions could result from being associated with unauthorized tactical training that resulted in casualties. So it spread through word of mouth, an underground transmission from experienced pilots to newer arrivals. Veterans would take replacement pilots aside after evening mess, usually with a beer or two to lubricate the conversation, and describe what actually worked in combat versus what the training manuals recommended. This informal education system was far more valuable than official training because it came from people who'd survived multiple encounters with Zeros and knew which tactics led to survival versus which led to names on casualty lists.